Owen Grayson sat in his sleek, glass-walled office overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city's lights reflected off the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a vibrant mosaic that seemed to pulse with the same energy driving his success. His latest venture, a groundbreaking app designed to revolutionize personal productivity, was only days away from launch. He should have been elated. Every detail had been perfected, every contingency planned. Yet, as he adjusted his tailored jacket and reviewed the press kit for the 1000th time, he felt the weight of expectation press against his chest like a vice. His assistant knocked softly before stepping inside. "The European investors want to confirm the timeline for the beta rollout," she said, her voice as polished and efficient as the rest of his team. Owen nodded without looking up, scanning the spreadsheets on his tablet. "Tell them it's on schedule. I'll call tomorrow to discuss the integration plans." The assistant left, and the room was silent once more, save for the hum of his devices. This was how he liked it. Controlled, precise, orderly. There was no space in Owen Grayson's world for messiness or uncertainty. Every facet of his life was carefully curated to reflect success, a personal brand built with meticulous care. Just as he closed the last file, his phone buzzed on the desk. He frowned at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, and it was well past business hours. Hesitation flickered through him before he answered. "Grayson," he said curtly. "Mr. Grayson," a soft but urgent voice replied. "This is St. Catherine's Hospital. I'm Nurse Rivera. I'm calling regarding Naomi Curtis." Owen leaned back in his chair, the name triggering a distant memory. Naomi. They had parted ways years ago, their brief relationship ending with mutual indifference, or so he thought. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, you must have the wrong person. I haven't spoken to Naomi in years." There was a pause. Then, the nurse's voice softened further. "I'm afraid this isn't a mistake. She listed you as her contact information. She passed away earlier tonight during childbirth." The words hit him like a cold wave, leaving him momentarily speechless. His grip tightened on the phone. I didn't know she was pregnant," he said, his voice cracking in a way that made him cringe. "She gave your name as the father of the baby," the nurse said gently. "The child is healthy but will need immediate care." Owen stood abruptly, the leather chair creaking beneath him. He stared out at the city, its glittering lights suddenly seeming garish. This couldn't be happening. He wasn't someone who dealt with situations like this. His life wasn't meant to unravel into chaos. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, more to himself than to the nurse. "I understand this is a lot to process," the nurse replied. "But we need you to come to the hospital. There are forms to sign and decisions to make." His head swam with a barrage of thoughts. He hadn't seen Naomi in years. How could she have been pregnant? Why hadn't she told him? Why would she say he is the father? Where was the real father? And a baby? A baby didn't fit into his life. Not now, not ever. Still, he found himself scribbling down the address the nurse provided. After all, if she had given them his name, it must have been because she had no other person to turn to. His hands trembled as he ended the call and set the phone down on the desk. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, a man who had built his empire on logic and control, now faced with something that defied both. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The city passed by in streaks of headlights and neon signs, the usual buzz of his thoughts replaced by a deafening silence. When he arrived, the sterile smell of disinfectant hit him as he stepped into the brightly lit lobby. His polished shoes squeaked faintly against the linoleum as he approached the front desk. "I'm here about Naomi Curtis," he said, his voice clipped. "I was told to come." The receptionist nodded and made a quick call before directing him to the maternity ward. He followed the nurse down a hallway lined with muted pastel walls, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step felt heavier, as if he were walking towards something irreversible. When they reached the room, Nurse Rivera greeted him with a sympathetic smile. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Grayson," she said. "This way." He hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering near the doorframe. Inside, the room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. In the corner, a clear bassinet held a tiny bundle swaddled in pale pink. His stomach clenched. "That's Mia," the nurse said softly, gesturing toward the baby. "She's healthy, but she'll need someone to take care of her." Owen's feet moved before his mind could catch up. He stepped closer, drawn to the bundle despite himself. The baby's face was impossibly small, her features delicate. A smattering of dark hair framed her forehead, and her tiny hands twitched occasionally in her sleep. "She's so small," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nurse Rivera nodded. "She is. But she's strong." Owen swallowed hard, his throat dry. "And Naomi? What happened? Why did she give my name as the father of the baby?" The nurse's expression showed doubt. He realized he must seem as one more father who didn't want to recognize their children. "During childbirth there were complications and unfortunately nothing we did was enough to save her. As to why she pointed you as the father, I can't answer that, but she must have trusted you." The weight of that statement pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He felt the urge to turn and walk away, to leave this entire situation behind. But he couldn't. Not yet. He glanced at the nurse. "What happens if I don't take her?" "She'll go into foster care until other arrangements can be made, including a paternity test," Rivera said carefully. "But she needs someone who can be there for her." Owen stared down at Mia, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with her soft breaths. A surge of emotions he couldn't name welled up inside him: fear, doubt, guilt, and something deeper that he didn't dare acknowledge. "I don't know anything about babies," he said, his voice cracking again. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," the nurse replied. "But you can start by holding her." He froze, panic flickering in his eyes. "I can't." Rivera stepped forward, her movements gentle but firm. She lifted Mia from the bassinet and placed her carefully in his arms. Owen's muscles tensed as he held her, his hands awkward and unsure. But then Mia stirred, her tiny fist brushing against his chest, and a warmth spread through him that was both foreign and unsettling. He looked down at her, his breath catching. "Mia," he whispered, trying the name on his tongue. It felt strange and natural all at once. As he stood there, holding the baby who had turned his world upside down, Owen Grayson realized his life was no longer his own. He just didn't know what that meant yet. Owen stood in the corner of the hospital room, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his impeccably tailored coat. The clinical smell of disinfectant was overwhelming, and the soft beeping of monitors felt unnervingly loud in the quiet space. His eyes were fixed on the baby in the bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling with each gentle breath. He hadn't moved much since Nurse Caroline had left him alone to gather his thoughts, but he wasn't gathering anything. He was unraveling. The door creaked open, and Caroline returned, her expression soft but steady. She was a sharp contrast to the cold, sterile surroundings, her demeanor both calming and authoritative. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, and her scrubs were practical yet cheery, a pale green dotted with daisies. She carried a clipboard against her hip and gave him a measured look. "How's it going?" she asked, as if this were the most ordinary situation in the world. Owen's laugh came out dry and humorless. "I've been better." Caroline stepped closer, glancing at the baby before turning her full attention to him. "I understand this is overwhelming, Mr. Grayson. It's a lot to process." "That's an understatement," he muttered, his eyes darting to the bassinet. "I don't know what to do with a baby. I haven't seen Naomi in years, I don't even know why I'm here." "She needs someone," Caroline said gently, but there was an edge to her tone that suggested she wouldn't let him wriggle out of this easily. I do not know your history, but Naomi trusted you enough to name you as Mia's father. That has to mean something. He shook his head, pacing toward the window. It's not that simple. I don't have room in my life for this. He gestured vaguely toward the bassinet, as if the baby were a misplaced piece of furniture. Caroline didn't flinch. No one is ever ready for this. But that doesn't mean it's not important. Before Owen could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. A man in a rumpled blazer and worn jeans stepped inside, his presence filling the room with an air of agitation. He was tall, with a rough, unshaven face and the kind of weary eyes that hinted at more than a few bad decisions. His gaze darted to the bassinet before landing on Owen. You must be Owen, the man said, his voice a mix of sarcasm and forced friendliness. I'm Max, Naomi's brother. Owen nodded stiffly, unsure what to make of him. I didn't realize Naomi had a brother. Yeah, well, we weren't exactly close, Max replied, scratching the back of his neck. But family's family, right? And since she's gone, I guess that makes me the closest thing Mia's got. Caroline's expression tightened, but she said nothing. Her eyes flicked between Max and Owen, clearly assessing the situation. If this man was indeed Naomi's brother, the woman must have had a very strong reason to ask the hospital to call another man to take care of her baby. Max stepped closer to the bassinet, his movements deliberate. Poor kid. She's gonna need someone who knows what they're doing. Someone who can give her a real home. Owen exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. So, you're offering to take her? Max shrugged. Of course. She's my niece. I'm not gonna let her end up with strangers. It was the out Owen hadn't dared to hope for. His chest felt lighter, as though a massive weight had been lifted. Well, that's great. If you're willing, then. Wait, Caroline interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. Have you thought this through? A baby is a huge responsibility. Max's face hardened. Of course I have. Like I said, she's family. Caroline's gaze didn't waver, but she stepped back, her expression unreadable. I see. Owen didn't notice the shift in Caroline's demeanor. He was too busy focusing on the exit ramp Max had just handed him. If you're sure, then I'll leave it in your hands, he said quickly, his voice tinged with relief. It's probably for the best. Max picked Mia up awkwardly, his hands fumbling as he cradled her against his chest. She stirred but didn't wake, her tiny face scrunching momentarily before settling back into sleep. Yeah, I'll take care of her. Don't worry about a thing. Owen nodded, eager to put the ordeal behind him. He turned to Caroline, who stood silently near the bassinet, her hands clasped tightly around the clipboard. Thank you for everything, he said, his tone perfunctory. But it looks like this is resolved. Caroline forced a tight smile, though her eyes betrayed her unease. Of course. Good luck, Mr. Grayson. Without another word, Owen left the room. The hospital corridor felt like a lifeline, drawing him further from the tangled mess he'd just escaped. His pace quickened as he approached the elevators, the weight of responsibility dissipating with each step. Back in the room, Caroline watched Max as he adjusted Mia in his arms. Something about his demeanor didn't sit right with her, the casual way he handled the baby, the slight tremor in his voice. But it wasn't her place to intervene. She had done her job. Or so she told herself. Take care of her, Caroline said finally, her voice low but firm. Max smirked. Yeah, sure thing. Caroline didn't move until the door clicked shut behind him. A pang of worry settled in her chest, but she pushed it aside. Owen Grayson had made his choice. Whether it was the right one or not wasn't up to her. The next morning, the sky over Chicago was clear, sunlight reflecting off the skyscrapers like scattered diamonds. In his corner office on the top floor of Grayson Tower, Owen sat at the head of a sleek conference table, nursing a cup of black coffee. The room hummed with muted conversation as his executive team gathered, their tailored suits and polished shoes a perfect match for the cold, glass and steel atmosphere. His legal counsel, Helen Carmichael, adjusted her glasses and placed a leather-bound notebook on the table. Next to her sat David Vaughn, his communications manager, scrolling through his tablet with the focus of a man preparing for battle. Owen leaned back in his chair, watching them with a detached expression. "Let's get this over with," he said, his tone brisk. "The app launch is in 3 days, and I don't want anything distracting us." David looked up, his brow furrowed. "You don't seem like yourself. What's going on?" Owen hesitated, then set his coffee down and crossed his arms. "Something unexpected happened last night." Helen arched a brow. "Define unexpected." Taking a deep breath, Owen recounted the events at the hospital. His voice remained calm, almost disinterested, as he described the call, Naomi's death, and the appearance of her estranged brother, Max. By the time he finished, the room had gone quiet. David was the first to break the silence. "So, let me get this straight. You're named as the father of this baby, and instead of taking her, you handed her off to some guy you've never met?" Owen's jaw tightened. "I didn't hand her off. Max is her uncle. He said he'd take care of her." Helen leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "And you didn't think to verify anything? Background checks? Legal guardianship? This could blow up in your face, Owen." "I didn't exactly have time for due diligence," he snapped. "It was late, and I needed to resolve the situation." David rubbed his temples, clearly exasperated. "Do you realize what could happen if this story leaks? The press would have a field day. Tech mogul abandons baby at hospital. Does that sound good for your brand?" Helen nodded in agreement. "David's right. It's not just a bad look, it's a potential legal nightmare. If Max does something irresponsible, and it traces back to you, it could tank more than just your reputation." Owen stared at them, irritation flickering across his face. "I had no choice. What was I supposed to do, become a single dad overnight? That is not my baby." "I have no idea why she would say that to the hospital." "That's not what we're saying," Helen said evenly. "But you're in damage control territory now. The safest move is to bring the baby back, at least temporarily, until we can sort this out with a paternity test. Anything less is a risk." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "You can't be serious. I don't have time for this. The launch is days away. I need to be focused." "And that's exactly why you should listen to us," David countered. "A scandal right now could overshadow everything. You'd be better off dealing with a baby in your penthouse than explaining this mess to reporters." Owen glanced out the window, the city sprawling beneath him. The thought of having his life disrupted by an infant was maddening. But the app launch was his top priority, and he couldn't afford distractions, or scandals. "Fine," he said finally, his voice clipped. "Do whatever you need to do. Get her back." Helen wasted no time. She made a quick call to her team, issuing precise instructions. By the time the meeting adjourned, her legal assistants were already en route to retrieve Mia. Owen left the conference room feeling trapped, caught between his aversion to chaos and the necessity of avoiding a PR disaster. Hours later, Owen returned to his penthouse to find Mia's arrival already underway. His space, normally immaculate and devoid of personal touches, was now invaded by the presence of a baby, with decorators redoing his guest room and moving baby furniture. Helen was there too, standing in the middle of his expansive living room with her arms crossed. She'd come to oversee Mia's transition, and she didn't look pleased. "She's on her way now. She will be here in about 30 minutes, Helen said, nodding toward a portable crib set up near the window. Her voice was calm, but her expression was firm. You will be needing to hire a nurse or a nanny to care for the baby. Owen loosened his tie and avoided her gaze. Let's do whatever is necessary. Helen took a step closer, her tone sharp enough to cut through his deflection. Why did you leave her with Max without considering possible consequences? He bristled. He's her uncle. Isn't that enough? But at least to check if what he was saying was the truth, Helen said pointedly. I did some checking. Thankfully, he really is the baby's uncle. But Max has a history of financial trouble. Gambling debts, evictions. It would have been a nightmare if the press got a hold of this story before we can run the paternity test. It would seem like child abandonment and in the hands of a cheap scoundrel. Owen's stomach turned. He'd been so eager to wash his hands of the situation that he hadn't stopped to think about the consequences. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I'm not cut out for this. I don't know anything about babies. Can you help me get help? Helen studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Sure. I do not know any services, but that must be easy enough to arrange. I just don't know if we will be able to choose and hire someone to start in a half hour. Maybe the nurse who talked to me in the hospital would be willing to make some extra money? She seemed reliable, he said after a long pause. In fact, if she agrees, she could stay here until all this is over. This will only be until the launch is over. Then we'll figure something else out. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line, and she nodded efficiently. I'll talk to her myself. Owen gave her a grateful nod, though his mind was already spinning with thoughts of meetings, deadlines, and the delicate balancing act ahead. As Helen moved to resolve everything, he stood by the window, staring out at the city once more. This wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't even close. But now it was his reality, whether he liked it or not. Owen sat at his desk, staring at the sleek, modern nursery that had been hastily assembled in his penthouse by a professional service. The once minimalist room now featured pastel wallpaper, a crib with tiny animal prints, and an array of baby supplies he couldn't begin to understand. He'd assumed adding a nursery would solve the problem, create a space for Mia and neatly compartmentalize the chaos she brought into his life. But the sight of it only reminded him of how unprepared he was. The rhythmic sound of Caroline's feet broke through his thoughts. She entered the room carrying Mia in her arms, the baby swaddled in a soft yellow blanket. Caroline's expression was a mix of determination, something he couldn't quite name, concern, perhaps, or disbelief. She adjusted the baby's position and looked directly at him. You don't have a clue, do you? She said. Not even close, Owen admitted. That's why I need your help. Thank you for agreeing to help. Caroline tilted her head, studying him. You're seriously asking me to be Mia's nanny? I work at a hospital, Mr. Grayson. This isn't exactly my area. You seemed like you knew what you were doing when I saw you with her, he countered. And I don't. At all. I'm willing to compensate you, generously. Caroline sighed, glancing down at Mia, who was blinking up at her with sleepy curiosity. This isn't about money for me. It's about making sure she's safe. That's exactly why I'm asking you, Owen said, leaning forward slightly. I need someone who actually cares about her well-being. Someone I can trust to handle this situation. Caroline hesitated, her fingers brushing lightly over Mia's blanket. Fine, she said at last. But I have conditions. You need to take this seriously, at least, like you say, until you sort this out. She's not just something you can outsource when it gets inconvenient. I get it, Owen replied, though his tone betrayed his doubts. I'm doing the best I can here. I'll believe that when I see it, she said, handing Mia to him with a deliberate slowness. His arms stiffened awkwardly, and Caroline sighed, adjusting his grip. Support her head. Like this. See? Owen followed her guidance, his movements stiff and unsure. Mia let out a soft coo, and for a moment, his expression softened. But as quickly as it appeared, the warmth was replaced by his usual guarded demeanor. The next morning, Owen left early for the office, his schedule packed with final preparations for the app launch. He gave Caroline a brief nod on his way out, barely pausing to glance at Mia, who was nestled in a bouncer near the kitchen. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Caroline shook her head, muttering under her breath. Back at the penthouse, Caroline settled into her new role with a mix of efficiency and quiet exasperation. Mia was an easy baby, by all accounts. Her cries were soft and infrequent, her needs predictable. Still, the weight of caring for her was made heavier by Owen's absence. He was gone from sunrise to well past sunset, leaving the penthouse eerily quiet save for the occasional gurgle or giggle from Mia. Owen's indifference was glaringly obvious. He rarely asked about Mia when he came home, instead retreating to his office or reviewing reports on his tablet. Yet despite his efforts to keep her at arm's length, small moments betrayed him. One evening, Caroline found him standing in the nursery doorway, staring at Mia as she slept in her crib. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't notice Caroline until she stepped closer. "Long day?" she asked softly. He nodded, not taking his eyes off Mia. "She's quiet when she sleeps," he said, almost to himself. Caroline leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "Babies tend to be. But it doesn't last long." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You've been doing a good job with her." "Thank you." Caroline smiled faintly. "She makes it easy. She's a sweet kid." Owen nodded again, his gaze drifting back to Mia. "I still don't know what I'm doing." "Most parents don't," Caroline said. "You figure it out as you go." But Owen didn't seem convinced. He finished his drink and left the room, the soft click of the door signaling his retreat. He wasn't a parent. Another day, as he sat on a conference call in his home office, Mia's laughter echoed from the living room. He paused mid-sentence, his focus broken. Peering through the open door, he saw Caroline holding Mia in her arms, twirling gently to a tune playing from her phone. Mia's giggles grew louder, her tiny hands reaching for the air as if trying to catch the music. Owen watched them for a moment longer than he intended, his lips curving into a small smile before he shook his head and turned back to his screen. Caroline noticed these moments, fleeting as they were. She didn't push him to engage more, knowing that Owen operated on his own timeline. But she couldn't help wondering if there was more to him than the detached exterior he projected. One afternoon, as she fed Mia a bottle, Owen returned home unexpectedly early. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, watching as Caroline cradled Mia, humming softly to her. "Back already?" she asked, glancing up at him. "Meeting got cancelled," he replied. His gaze lingered on Mia, who had fallen asleep mid-feed, her tiny hand resting against the bottle. "You can hold her, you know," Caroline said, a hint of challenge in her tone. He hesitated. "I don't want to wake her." Caroline smiled. "She'll be fine. Here." Before he could protest, she gently transferred Mia into his arms. Owen stiffened at first, his movements uncertain. But as he adjusted his hold, he found himself mesmerized by the tiny rise and fall of her chest. "She's lighter than I thought," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "She's growing fast," Caroline replied, watching him carefully. "Won't be this small forever." Owen didn't respond, his focus entirely on the baby in his arms. A strange sense of calm settled over him, one he couldn't explain. Later that evening, as Mia slept in her crib, Owen found himself scrolling through his phone, not for work emails but for articles about parenting. He read about milestones, sleep schedules, and feeding routines, his brows furrowed in concentration. The morning of the app launch dawned with a palpable sense of anticipation. Grayson Tower buzzed with activity, a choreographed frenzy of executives, assistants, and tech teams ensuring that every detail was flawless. Owen strode into the boardroom, his presence commanding as he reviewed the final rollout strategy. His team hung on his every word, their confidence bolstered by his relentless focus and unshakable calm. When the countdown ended, the app went live, its sleek interface lighting up devices around the world. Social media exploded with praise, industry leaders applauded the innovation, and analysts hailed Owen as a visionary. By evening, his face was plastered across tech blogs and financial news segments, the golden boy of Silicon Valley with another triumph to his name. At the celebratory dinner, surrounded by clinking glasses and murmurs of congratulations, Owen felt an odd dissonance. The success was everything he'd worked for, yet his mind drifted elsewhere, to a yellow nursery tucked into a corner of his penthouse, to the soft gurgles and coos of a baby who didn't belong in his meticulously structured world. The weight of her presence, temporary as it was meant to be, lingered. The next morning, with the launch secure and accolades pouring in, Owen made the decision he'd been avoiding. He instructed his assistant to arrange for a DNA test. It was a necessary step, he told himself, a way to bring order to a chaotic situation. Once it was confirmed Mia wasn't his, he could finally close this chapter and move forward. The results came back quickly, delivered in a slim envelope to his office. Owen opened it with steady hands, his eyes scanning the document with clinical detachment. His breath hitched slightly at the confirmation, Mia was not biologically his. Despite being sure she wasn't his, relief washed over him, quick and undeniable. The responsibility no longer had to be his. By the end of the day, the arrangements were made. Owen called Max and informed him that Mia would be returned to his care. The transfer happened without fanfare. Max arrived at the penthouse, his demeanor smug but outwardly polite, as he collected the baby. Owen barely looked at Mia, afraid that even the slightest hesitation would unravel his resolve. "She'll be fine with me," Max said, adjusting Mia in his arms. "Don't worry about a thing." Owen nodded curtly, closing the door with a sense of finality. He stood in the silence of his apartment, staring at the space that Mia had briefly occupied. The crib, the toys, the bottles, all of it felt out of place now, like remnants of a story he'd chosen to end. The following week, Owen received an unexpected call from Naomi's lawyer, a somber man named Mr. Albright. He invited Owen to his office to discuss Naomi's will. Owen hesitated but ultimately agreed. Curiosity and a sense of unfinished business pulled at him, though he told himself it was just due diligence. Mr. Albright's office was unremarkable, a sea of beige walls and overstuffed filing cabinets. The lawyer greeted Owen with a firm handshake before leading him to a small conference room. A folder lay on the table, its edges worn, as if it had been opened and closed many times. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Grayson," Albright began, his tone measured. "Naomi left specific instructions regarding Mia's care, and I felt it was important to share them with you personally." Owen sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the folder. "I've already relinquished custody to Max," he said. "I don't see what else needs to be discussed." Albright gave him a long look before opening the folder. Naomi explicitly stated in her will that Mia should not be placed in Max's care. She cited his history of financial instability and his inability to provide a safe environment for the child. Owen frowned, his chest tightening. Then why would she list him as an option? "She didn't," Albright said, sliding a handwritten letter across the table. "This is for you." Owen hesitated before picking up the letter. Naomi's handwriting was familiar yet distant, her words curling across the page with an intimacy that felt intrusive. "Owen. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry. I knew I was sick during pregnancy and that maybe I wouldn't survive childbirth. I went to many doctors, but there was nothing no one could do. I know this is unfair, asking you to step into a role you never wanted, but I had no one else to trust. I conceived her through a donor, the plan was always to raise her on my own, and Max. He is not to be trusted, his mind is only in the money he will secure by being Mia's legal guardian. Mia needs stability, love, and someone who can give her the world, not as a prize, but as a foundation. You've always been so strong, so capable. I see more in you than you let others see, and I believe Mia can bring out the best in you. Our relationship ended in friendship and immense admiration. I know this is more than anyone can ask another person, but please take care of her. She'll change you in ways you can't imagine. Thank you. Naomi. Owen set the letter down, his pulse quickening. Naomi's words stirred something deep and unfamiliar, a mix of anger, guilt, and reluctant understanding. She had handed him a burden wrapped in trust, and he didn't know whether to resent her or admire her for it. Mr. Grayson, Albright said gently, breaking the silence. This is a difficult decision, but Naomi believed in you. She believed Mia was better off with you than anyone else. Owen stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need time to think, he said, his voice tight. He left the office, the letter folded carefully in his pocket. As he stepped into the bustling streets of Chicago, the city's noise and movement felt distant, muffled by the weight of Naomi's request. Back at the penthouse, Owen poured himself a drink and sat in the dim light of his living room. His reflection stared back at him from the glass coffee table, a man who had everything he'd ever worked for, and yet. The nursery door was slightly ajar, a sliver of pale yellow light spilling into the hallway. He hadn't bothered to dismantle it, as if part of him knew the story wasn't over. The crib stood empty, a silent reminder of what he'd chosen to let go. Owen closed his eyes, Naomi's words echoing in his mind. She believed in him. She thought he was capable of more than he allowed himself to imagine. But could he be what Mia needed? Could he bear the weight of a life that wasn't part of his plan? He didn't have an answer yet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that walking away from Mia had been more than just a practical decision. It had been a mistake. The next day, Owen sat alone in his office, the letter from Naomi resting on the desk in front of him. Its presence felt heavy, almost accusatory, though it was nothing more than paper and ink. The city lights outside flickered against the night sky, casting reflections on the polished surface of his desk. He had already read it twice, each word striking a nerve that left him raw and uncertain. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to press away the thoughts swirling in his mind. How dare she? How could Naomi decide that he, of all people, should carry this responsibility? His life was carefully calibrated, each piece fitting together with precision. There was no room for an infant, no space for the chaos she would inevitably bring. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room, the letter still clutched in his hand. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, bubbling up in bursts of frustration. Naomi had disrupted his world with a single letter, and now she wasn't even here to answer for it. What was she thinking? He muttered to the empty room, his voice tinged with disbelief. She had no right to put this on me. But as the words left his mouth, they rang hollow. The anger felt misplaced, like shouting at a storm for being wet. He tossed the letter onto the desk and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he stared out at the city. Yet as much as he wanted to push it all away, his thoughts kept drifting back to Mia. The way her tiny hand had grasped his finger with surprising strength. The soft sound of her breathing as she slept in his arms. The memory of her giggle, bright and unfiltered, like sunlight breaking through clouds. He had tried to distance himself, to see her as someone else's responsibility, but she lingered in his mind. Small moments replayed in vivid detail, unbidden and unstoppable. He thought of her yellow blanket, the one Caroline had tucked around her in the nursery. He thought of how she had looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, as if she knew nothing of the doubt and turmoil he carried. Owen's frustration turned inward, gnawing at him like a restless ache. He hated how much he missed her. It made no sense. She had been in his life for a matter of weeks, and yet her absence felt jarring, like something vital had been removed. He glanced at the nursery door, still partially open, the faint scent of baby powder lingering in the air. He hadn't had the heart to dismantle it. The crib was still there, along with the toys and the rocker Caroline had insisted on. It was as if the room itself refused to let him forget. Sitting back down, he picked up the letter again, reading it more slowly this time. Naomi's words seemed softer now, less accusatory and more pleading. She had trusted him, not because she wanted to burden him, but because she believed in him. Integrity, she had written. The word echoed in his mind, dredging up memories of times when he'd prided himself on doing the right thing, even when it was inconvenient. He had built his career on principles of trust and responsibility. Was this any different? The drink sat untouched as he wrestled with his thoughts. He had spent years constructing a life that was orderly, efficient, and entirely his own. Mia was the opposite of all that, a small, unpredictable force of nature who had the power to unravel everything he'd built. And yet, he thought of her small fist curling around his finger, the quiet warmth of her as she slept against his chest. Those moments had felt inexplicably grounding, even if he hadn't wanted to admit it at the time. Owen sighed, running a hand through his hair. The anger was fading now, replaced by something deeper and harder to define. He didn't know what Naomi had seen in him that made her think he could do this, but her belief was written in every line of her letter. As the night stretched on, the city outside continued its restless motion. Owen stayed at his desk, the letter in his hand and a weight in his chest that refused to go away. The question wasn't whether he could go back to his carefully constructed life. The question was whether he wanted to. Owen stared at the phone in his hand, hesitating as he dialed the familiar number. His mother picked up on the second ring, her warm voice cutting through the tension that had been building in his chest all morning. "Owen," she said, a hint of surprise in her tone. "Is everything all right? It's not like you to call during the day." "I need some advice," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "About something personal." She laughed softly. "Well, that's new." "All right, I'm listening." He explained everything, from the unexpected arrival of Mia to Naomi's letter and his struggle with what to do. His words tumbled out in a disjointed stream, his usual precision replaced by uncertainty. By the time he finished, the silence on the other end was almost deafening. "You sound scared," his mother finally said, her voice gentle. "I don't know what I'm doing," he confessed. "This wasn't part of the plan." "Plans change, Owen. Life has a way of throwing us curveballs when we least expect it." There was a pause, and he could almost picture her thoughtful expression. "You've always been good at listening to your instincts. Trust your heart. It's never steered you wrong before." He frowned, leaning back in his chair. "What if it's too much? What if I fail?" "You won't," she said simply. "You'll figure it out, just like you always do. And if you don't, you'll learn. That's what makes you human." Her words lingered long after the call ended. Owen sat in silence, staring at the city skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore Mia. That evening, he picked up the phone again and called Caroline. She answered after a few rings, her voice a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Owen," she asked. "What's going on?" "I need your help," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "I'm bringing Mia back. I can't do it alone, and you're the only person I trust." Caroline hesitated, her tone softening. "Are you sure about this?" "Not entirely," he admitted. "But I'm willing to try." Caroline sighed, then chuckled faintly. "All right. I'll help. But you'd better mean it this time." The next day, Mia returned to the penthouse, her presence filling the once quiet space with new energy. Caroline arrived shortly after, slipping seamlessly into her role. The adjustment was immediate and intense, pulling Owen into a world he barely recognized. The first night was chaos. Owen fumbled with a diaper change, the instructions Caroline had given him evaporating from his mind as Mia wriggled on the changing table. Powder and wipes scattered across the floor as he muttered a string of curses under his breath. "You're making it harder than it needs to be," Caroline said from the doorway, her arms crossed and a smile tugging at her lips. "Helpful," he shot back, finally managing to secure the diaper. "Remind me why people do this willingly?" She laughed, stepping in to tidy up the mess. "You'll get the hang of it. Eventually." Sleep became a distant memory. Mia's cries echoed through the penthouse at odd hours, dragging Owen out of bed with bleary eyes and a sense of growing desperation. He spent more nights pacing the living room with her in his arms than he cared to admit, whispering soft reassurances as she fussed. Despite the exhaustion, there were moments of unexpected humor. One afternoon, he attempted to feed Mia her bottle, only for her to sneeze mid-sip, spraying milk onto his shirt. Caroline nearly doubled over with laughter when she walked in to find him standing there, shirt soaked and a stunned expression on his face. "Welcome to parenthood," she teased, grabbing a towel. But amid the chaos, something shifted. Owen found himself drawn to Mia in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her giggles became a balm for his stress, her tiny hands grasping at his tie or his fingers with surprising strength. He caught himself watching her as she babbled to herself in her crib or squealed with delight when Caroline played peekaboo. One evening, after a particularly long day, Owen sat on the floor of the nursery with Mia in his lap. She clutched a soft stuffed elephant, gnawing on its ear as she looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. He smiled, brushing a strand of her hair back. "You're something else, you know that," he murmured. Caroline stood just outside the door, watching the scene unfold. Her heart swelled as she saw the way Owen looked at Mia, no longer with uncertainty, but with a growing affection that was impossible to ignore. She found herself smiling more when she was around him. His dry humor, his quiet determination, the way he tried so hard despite his doubts, it all chipped away at her professional detachment. She hated how easily he made her laugh or how her pulse quickened when he thanked her for something small. But Caroline was nothing if not disciplined. She kept her feelings firmly under wraps, focusing on Mia and pushing her own emotions aside. After all, this wasn't about her. The days blurred into weeks, and the penthouse transformed into a vibrant, albeit chaotic, home. Toys and baby supplies crept into every corner, replacing the cold, minimalist decor Owen had once prized. Caroline began to notice the change in him. He was softer now, more patient. He didn't just tolerate Mia's presence, he embraced it. He read books to her, even when she couldn't understand the words, and he learned to rock her to sleep without fumbling. One evening, as Caroline prepared to leave, Owen stopped her at the door. He looked at her, his expression sincere and his voice quiet. "Thank you, Caroline," he said. "For everything. I couldn't do this without you." She smiled, feeling her cheeks warm. "You're doing more than you think, Owen. She's lucky to have you." As she walked down the hall, her heart ached in a way she couldn't quite explain. Watching Owen and Mia together had become both a joy and a quiet torment, a constant reminder of feelings she wasn't sure she could contain. Inside the penthouse, Owen sat with Mia on his lap, her tiny fingers gripping his thumb as she yawned. He looked down at her, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions he couldn't name. He had stepped into this world reluctantly, but it was beginning to feel less like a burden and more like something he couldn't imagine letting go. Owen stood in the nursery, leaning against the crib where Mia babbled happily, kicking her legs in the air. The light streaming through the pale yellow curtains cast a soft glow over the room, illuminating the changes that had taken hold of his life. The walls, once sterile and blank, were now adorned with colorful decals of animals and clouds. Shelves lined with books and toys had replaced minimalist decor, and a stuffed giraffe sat proudly on the rocking chair in the corner. It was a far cry from the cold, structured penthouse he once called home. He reached down to tickle Mia's belly, earning a delighted squeal that made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. She grabbed his finger with surprising strength, her tiny hand curling around it as if she'd never let go. Owen smiled, his decision crystallizing in that moment. He had been hesitant, full of doubts and questions, but those faded now. There was no life he could envision without her. That afternoon, he met with his lawyer to finalize the adoption paperwork. The process was meticulous, requiring signatures, verifications, and a clear declaration of intent. As Owen signed the final document, he felt an unexpected sense of peace. Fatherhood had found him when he wasn't looking for it, but now, it was the most important role he would ever play. The transformation of the penthouse mirrored the changes in Owen himself. The once pristine space buzzed with life. Mia's giggles echoed through the halls, and her toys spilled over into every room. Caroline had made the kitchen a hub of warmth, adding her own touch with cheerful hand towels and an endless supply of snacks. Even the imposing office now housed a playpen in the corner, where Mia often napped while Owen worked. Caroline noticed the shift in him. He was more patient, his edges softened by Mia's presence. He had learned to juggle bedtime stories with conference calls, his suits occasionally accessorized with baby food smudges. She watched him grow into the role with an admiration she couldn't shake. And that was the problem. The nursery was quiet except for the soft hum of the baby monitor. Caroline stood by the door, her posture tense as she held an envelope in her hand. Owen, seated on the floor stacking blocks with Mia, looked up at her and smiled briefly, but the smile faded when he noticed her hesitant expression. "I need to talk to you," she said, stepping further into the room. Owen gently scooped up Mia, who was babbling away, and set her in the playpen before standing. "What's going on?" Caroline handed him the envelope. "It's my resignation." The words hit like a misstep on a staircase, unexpected and jarring. He looked at the envelope but didn't open it. "Why? Is something wrong?" She exhaled, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "It's me. I've developed feelings for you, and it's not appropriate. I can't work here anymore, not like this." Owen's brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He set the envelope on a nearby shelf and crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Caroline. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she interrupted, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I just thought you deserved honesty." He nodded, glancing briefly at Mia, who had now latched onto the edge of the playpen, watching them curiously. "I appreciate that. But I need to be honest too. My focus right now is on Mia. There's no space in my life for anything else." "I'm sorry." Caroline offered a small, understanding smile. "I figured as much. You're an incredible father, Owen. You've done more than anyone could have expected." "That means a lot," he said, his tone softening. "I hope you know how much I've valued your help. I couldn't have gotten through this without you." She nodded, blinking quickly to keep her emotions at bay. "I'll make sure to connect you with some excellent candidates to replace me. You and Mia deserve the best." Owen stepped forward, offering a handshake that felt formal but necessary. She accepted, her grip firm even as her heart ached. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." "Take care of her," Caroline replied, glancing at Mia with a tender smile. "She's lucky to have you." With that, she left, her footsteps echoing softly down the hall. The months that followed were a blur of adjustment. Owen hired 2 nannies, each capable and attentive. Still, he focused on Mia, throwing himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he once reserved for his career. His mornings became a blend of diaper changes and breakfast battles. Evenings were filled with bedtime stories and lullabies. The sleek penthouse transformed further, with pastel hues and tiny shoes scattered across the floor. Parenting wasn't easy, but he found moments of joy he hadn't anticipated. One summer afternoon, Owen decided to take Mia to the park. The sun was high, casting a golden glow over the playground as children's laughter echoed through the air. He pushed Mia in her stroller toward the ice cream stand, where a line of eager customers had already formed. As he waited, he noticed a familiar figure a few places ahead. A woman with her auburn hair loosely tied back, wearing a simple sundress that swayed in the breeze. It was Caroline. She hadn't seen him yet, her attention focused on the menu. He debated whether to approach her, but before he could decide, Mia made the choice for him. The sound caught Caroline's attention, and she turned, her eyes widening slightly as she met Owen's gaze. Then she smiled, her expression warm but cautious. "Hi," she said, stepping out of line to greet them. "Hi," Owen replied, his voice betraying a mix of surprise and something softer. Mia, undeterred by the adult's hesitation, leaned forward in the stroller, her small hands reaching for Caroline. Caroline glanced at Owen, who shrugged with a sheepish grin. "Seems like someone missed you," he said. Caroline crouched to Mia's level, her smile growing as she lifted the baby into her arms. Mia squealed in delight, her little hands patting Caroline's cheeks as if to confirm she was real. "She's gotten so big," Caroline said, her voice tinged with wonder. "She's thriving," Owen replied, his gaze softening as he watched the two of them. They chatted briefly, their conversation light and easy. Owen told her about Mia's milestones, and Caroline shared updates on her new job. The awkwardness faded quickly, replaced by the familiarity of their shared history. When the line moved forward, Caroline handed Mia back to Owen. The baby protested, her tiny hands reaching for Caroline even as Owen settled her in his arms. "I should let you go," Caroline said, though her smile lingered. "Yeah," Owen replied, shifting Mia to his hip. "It was good to see you." "You too," she said, turning to leave. Caroline reached the edge of the park and paused. Something made her turn, her eyes landing on Owen. He was still standing near the ice cream stand, holding Mia and looking directly at her. They shared a smile, she turned and walked away.